Joe Walcott, the Barbados demon, faced many unfair disadvantages throughout his career. Among these unfair disadvantages, and the topic of the short documentary, is also the fact that his manager Tom O'Rourke did a job on him. Today, we will be going through and exploring the dirty actions that Tom O'Rourke committed in the year 1900. We will also be going through the mysterious and controversial fifth fight between Tommy West and Joe Walcott. Joe Walcott had his first fight under Tom O'Rourke's management on the 15th of October 1892 against Jesse Moulton. Jesse Moulton was a decent fighter, but nowhere near a match for Joe Walcott. Joe Walcott beat him from pillar to post, leaving his face bloody. But like I said, this documentary is not about that. This documentary is exclusively about the dirty actions that Tom O'Rourke committed in the year 1900 and Tommy West vs. Joe Walcott 5. So this story doesn't begin there, but begins on the 23rd of February 1900 against Joe Chowinski.
Well, you know about the fight with Joe Chowinski. I fought him down at the Broadway Club in 1900. January the 12th. Well, all the people was thinking it was a shame to put such a small man up against Joe Chowinski. Well, yes, it was a shame, but it was on Chowinski's side. Chowinski led a straight left hand to me, and I drove my right hand underneath of his left guard, and from keep on occasionally punching him out of that guard, I broke his ribs. Well, then the crowd began hollering and cheering. Chowinski was an awful beaten man.
This fight shot Joe Walcott's career into national fame. You know, who wouldn't want to see the 5'1" welterweight that absolutely destroyed the heavyweight great Joe Chowinski? You know, who wouldn't? The newspapers were flooded with his name every day, 20 to 30 articles about Joe Walcott. Not to mention his next couple of fights would do extremely well, especially his fight against mysterious Billy Smith, which became an instant classic, a great war between two great warriors. But sadly, Joe Walcott wouldn't be able to enjoy his newly gained fame, because on June the 2nd, he caught typhoid pneumonia. Joe Walcott, the well-known colored pugilist, is ill with typhoid fever at his quarters, New Drop. Unless Walcott recovers rapidly, his matches with Joe Chowinski and Bill Stiff will be postponed. As you just saw, this will be a huge letdown for Joe Walcott. Not only his rematch with Joe Chowinski, but also his matches with Tommy West and Bill Stiff would have to be cancelled. But despite the doctors telling Joe Walcott not to, he still went into training for the Joe Chowinski rematch. Now hold on for a second. I want you people to imagine, being sick with typhoid pneumonia and still going into training. It's crazy, isn't it? But sadly, Joe Chowinski wanted no part of Joe Walcott again. So he went to Chicago and avoided the match. But even if Joe Chowinski wanted the Joe Walcott match, he wouldn't have got the chance to. Because Joe Walcott went back into training, his condition got way worse. I guess the doctors were right. And do you know what this meant? This meant that Joe Walcott could not fight or train and would have to stay home and rest for at least the next 2 months. On July the 25th, we get to see what kind of disgraceful person Tom O'Rourke really is. On July the 25th, Joe Walcott went to meet up with Tom O'Rourke to tell him that he's not going to be able to fight his next couple of fights. You know why, obviously, because he was sick with typhoid pneumonia. I don't want to spoil it too much, but let's just say Tom O'Rourke wasn't happy with this and proceeded to say some very disgraceful things. Here's Joe Walcott describing what happened at the meeting and giving his thoughts on it. Have O'Rourke and I split? Well, to tell the truth, yes. I have no manager now, and if I should ever return to the ring, I'll do all of my fighting on my own hook. I've never had a contract with O'Rourke, so there are no strings attached to me. I've been with O'Rourke for a long time, but he did not treat me meanly until the other day. You remember, don't you, when I was sick with typhoid pneumonia at New Drop some weeks ago? Well, at the time I was matched with Bill Stift at Denver. When I recovered from my illness, I was not very strong, and consequently I had to call off the match. O'Rourke came to me and asked why I did this. I told him that I did not care to take any chances. Then I said that I thought I would be in condition to fight Tommy West at the Broadway Athletic Club the earlier part of next month. But he could not see into that, and when he could not agree, he got angry and he called me down. He said my color was cheap and that N-words, plural, were no good anyway. Why, that was a nice crack for him to make me, wasn't it? I'm sorry this thing happened, because we have been together for so many years. Hold your thoughts, because it gets even worse. Because not only does Tom O'Rourke admit to saying those disgusting racist things, he makes the most ridiculous excuse for it as well. Walcott came to me on Tuesday, said O'Rourke, and told me that he was not being treated right. While discussing fights, I informed him that he had better get into condition before September the 1st, as he could make plenty of money doing so. But he shook his head and declared that he would not do any fighting until October. I did not like the idea of him being idle until that time, and told him that he must fight. He got fresh and after making a lot of threats, left. I did say that his color was cheap. The reason I made this remark was because he brought a lot of colored fellows with him every time he came to see me. I did not want them around my place, and this made him sore. He won't retire, you can bet that, and if he ever fights again, it will be under my management. It's crazy to think about the times Joe Walcott fought in, where it's okay for a manager to say those kind of things to his fighter. Tom O'Rourke is an absolute disgusting racist. See that last part where Tom O'Rourke said that he won't retire, that Joe Walcott won't retire. You can bet that, and if he ever fights again, it will be under my management. Remember that, put that in the back of your head, because it's going to be very, very, very important later on. I won't spoil it now, but you're going to see why. Despite how bad this sounds, it did end up playing into Joe Walcott's hands, for the time being at least, because you'll see things get way worse. So, how did it play in Joe Walcott's hands? Well, after changing his mind on retiring and managing himself, he hired a new manager by the name of Jack Doherty. See, Jack Doherty, he ended up doing some pretty good things for Walcott. He tried getting some great fights for him. They got together, and as soon as they got together, Jack Doherty made offers to Jim Jeffries for a fight. But sadly, Jim Jeffries didn't take the offer seriously. Jack Doherty went on to try and arrange a Tommy West bout. The one that got cancelled, they tried to rearrange it for late August. They were also in talks of making another match with mysterious Billy Smith, since the last fight had been such a great success. They also got guaranteed by Tom Sharkey that Joe Walcott and Tom Sharkey would face each other, Tom Sharkey the heavyweight. And to top it all off, they even were in talks of arranging a title match with Rube Ferns. As good as this all sounds, yeah? Sadly, many people didn't like seeing Joe Walcott doing good, and especially his manager, Tom O'Rourke. On August the 8th, news comes out that Tom O'Rourke is trying to prevent Joe Walcott from ever fighting again in New York. And when you say he's trying to prevent Joe Walcott from ever fighting again in New York, you have to remember these are the early 1900s, yeah? And when people try to prevent you from doing something or threaten you, they mean it. And there's going to be some bullets behind it. Here's Joe Walcott's reaction. So Tom O'Rourke says he's going to prevent me from fighting in New York, said Joe Walcott yesterday. Well, I don't think he'll get the chance, for I'll do all of my fighting outside of the city. I'm just as good a card in other cities as I am around here, and I guess I can get the coin without any trouble. Joe Walcott didn't seem fazed by Tom O'Rourke's threats. He was determined to go on with his career and have great success doing so. But sadly, Tom O'Rourke was also determined. Remember what he said earlier? About that if Walcott ever fights again, it will be under his management. You can bet that. Well, he meant that. And he continued meaning that too. Because on August the 20th, Tom O'Rourke writes to a friend in Boston that the clubhouse he proposed to build within 40 minutes ride of New York will not be opened until October or November. O'Rourke also states that he will not permit Joe Walcott to box West in New York unless Walcott does business under his management. As much as how great Joe Walcott's career is, it is also an incredibly tragic career. Because despite Joe Walcott having an incredible amount of talent, he was always forced into situations where he had to hire this man or fire that man, throw this fight or throw that fight, not fight this man or cancel that match. In a way, Joe Walcott was a puppet being held up by strings, in the sense that he was not in control of his own career. Peace again reigns between Tom O'Rourke and Joe Walcott. Joe called upon Tom on Saturday and asked to be taken back. Walcott said that he was sorry that he quit Tom and begged the latter to bury the past, which O'Rourke did. O'Rourke told a newspaper reporter yesterday that the match between Walcott and West is clinched and that the two would fight at Madison Square Garden on August the 29th instead of August the 28th. If it's not already obvious, on August the 25th, Joe Walcott left Jack Doherty and went back to Tom O'Rourke again. The obvious question now is, why did Joe Walcott go back to Tom O'Rourke? After Tom O'Rourke had treated him badly, said racist slurs against him, and blacklisted him. Yeah, if it's not obvious, that whole thing where Tom O'Rourke had said that Joe Walcott was not allowed to box in New York again unless he's under Tom O'Rourke's management is basically blacklisting. Yeah, Tom O'Rourke blacklisted Joe Walcott, and Joe Walcott was left with no choice but to go back to Tom O'Rourke because he had a family to feed. Despite Joe Walcott saying he could still get the coin anywhere, not being able to box in the capital of boxing was too much of a loss. August the 27th, 1900 would not only be the same day that it was announced that Joe Walcott was no longer fighting under Jack Doherty's management and had hired Tom O'Rourke again, it'd also be the same day that Tommy West vs. Joe Walcott 5 would take place. Both men were well prepared and in splendid condition. Joe Walcott was the favorite coming into the fight. The fight took place at the newly built 20th Century Club in New York. The 20th Century Club was jam-packed, but little did the people attending know of what was about to take place. Walcott was the first to score. He missed with his left and landed his right on the body. West fell short in a try for the head, and in a rush Walcott got in a left on the wind lightly. They opened the second round with a rush to a clinch, in which Tommy hooked his left to the neck and crossed his right to the head. Then West sent a hard left to the body. Walcott rushed his man to the ropes, sending lefts to the wind. West responded with a hard right on the body. From a clinch, Joe swung twice for the head, but West jumped away. In the third, they exchanged body punches. Walcott swung widely without landing and West stepped in with left on the face. West was cautioned for hugging. Walcott rushed him viciously, missing with his right but landing his left on the body. He rushed again, but Tommy escaped to the ropes. At the opening of the fourth round, West took his right to the body and brought it up to the head. Tommy jabbed a hard left to the face, but Walcott missed the left from the body and got a jab in on the face from West. Joe caught West on the ropes, landing his right over the kidneys. At close quarters, Walcott got to West's body repeatedly. Walcott came up smiling for the fifth and had the better of some swift half-arm work, in which he hooked his right twice to the head. He rushed West into the latter's corner and sent in two very hard lefts on Tommy's stomach, which made West clinch. West was bleeding from the left eye when he got back to his corner. In the sixth, Walcott ripped his left into the body, and Tommy got in his left up to Joe's chin. Clinches were frequent in this round, and some hot exchanges occurred with honors even. West's right eye was damaged in this round. Walcott landed a left on the ribs as the beginner for the seventh round. West replied with a left and a right on the body. Walcott kept working with his left into the wind. West jabbed a hard left to the face. In return, Walcott landed two stiff lefts to the body, one of which was low, and he was cautioned by the referee. West punched his left to the pit of the stomach and hooked his right to the ear. West came up lively in the eighth round. He sent a left to the face. Walcott countered to the body. At close quarters, Walcott landed to the head 3 times, and West got to the body with both hands. West landed a good right on Walcott's body. There was plenty of infighting in the 10th, and Walcott seemed to revel in this kind of work. West stabbed in with his left twice in the face and cut Walcott's mouth with a left jab. Walcott caught Tommy to the rope and put in 2 solid lefts to the body and in the pit of the stomach. These blows sent West to his corner, much weakened. Walcott worked to the body in the next round. He was very quick and got to the body and head with telling force. West's best blows were lefts to the face, but Walcott offset these by forcing Tommy to his corner with swinging lefts to the wind. The bell rang for the 12th. Walcott stood in his corner and refused to resume the fight. He claimed that his left arm was injured. West went right over to him and shaped himself. Walcott stood with his arms down, and Charlie White, the referee, told him to go and fight. Then, as Walcott refused, White counted off to 10 seconds and declared West was the winner, saying that at the time he did not believe that Walcott was in any way injured. In his opinion, the N-word quit from dishonest motives. Manager Jim Kennedy entered the ring and through the announcer said that as Walcott had deliberately quit, the N-word share of the purse would go to some charitable institution. Before we start talking about why Joe Walcott quit, let's first read the in-depth description of how Walcott quit. When he returned to his corner, at the end of the 11th round, he turned to Tom O'Rourke, his manager. Okay, let's pause for a second. Tom O'Rourke is almost always. I hardly remember any fights where Tom O'Rourke was absent from Joe Walcott's corner, especially where he was still in the arena and not, attending to some business somewhere else. So keep that in mind. And say Tom, that left hand of mine has gone back on me. Oh, go out and fight him, said Tom. He's licked now. Walcott sat in his corner, and it was not until the referee went over to him that he arose from his chair and walked out. He said that he was unable to continue, and White reeled off the 10 seconds count. Doesn't really sound like Joe Walcott, does it, to quit because he's injured his arm. He fought a couple of fights with his arms injured. And to really hammer it home, the club physician thought Walcott was not injured. Walcott was led from the ring to the dressing room, and there the club's physician examined his arm. "There's nothing the matter with your arm," he said to the pugilist. "Indeed there is, sir. Just feel where the bones are broken." The doctor once more examined the arm, and turned to Walcott and said, "Joe, you're faking it. Your arm is just as good as mine. You quit to West, and you well know it." And there's a little extra. Let's also go through what the referee Charlie White had to say about Walcott quitting. And the referee was outspoken in reference to Walcott's peculiar actions. White said, "Walcott was not injured. He quit deliberately, and it was my candid, confirmed opinion that he was actuated in quitting by some dishonest motive. I believe that Walcott was encouraged to act as he did by some person closely connected with him. That he should act thus is no surprise to me, as he has established a precedent for similar work in San Francisco not very long ago. And I think it was a scheme to hurt the management of the 20th Century Club, which has all along acted in good faith." It's funny that Charlie White thinks that Walcott was encouraged to throw the fight by someone close to him. Well, that seems like a perfect candidate for Tom O'Rourke, doesn't it? And a peculiar thing, right, about this fight is that after Walcott quit, not many newspapers, in fact, hardly any newspapers, trashed Joe Walcott for doing it. Usually when, a black fighter would quit a fight for, dishonest motives or honest motives, they would always call him a yellow belly or, trash him, drag his name through the mud. Even the ringside officials, the referees, the doctors would do the same. But in this fight, it seems like not only the newspapers thought that Tom O'Rourke forced Joe to throw the fight, But also, the club manager, the referee, the ringside doctor, name it up, they all thought that Tom O'Rourke forced Joe to throw it. Before we start talking about why Tom O'Rourke forced Joe Walcott to throw the Tommy West fight, we first need to prove that Tom O'Rourke did throw the fight. And this is really easy because Tom O'Rourke couldn't be less slick. Tom O'Rourke's boys were caught, or should I say spotted, going around the boxes offering 100 to 60 on West. This article contradicts many of the statements that Tom O'Rourke made about the fight. It also proves that Tom O'Rourke knew that there was going to be a fixing, because why would he then send his own people to put money for him against his own guy? Of course, unless he knew there was a fixing. But knowing there is a fixing doesn't necessarily mean fixing, if you know what I mean. For that, we need a motive. For our motive, I have 3 key pieces of evidence. The first one being reports on Tom O'Rourke building a club not far from the 20th Century Club that would house 10,000 people. The second one, the public beef that he stirred up himself with the manager of the 20th Century Athletic Club, Jim Kennedy. And the third one being that letter that Tom O'Rourke sent to his so-called friend about the club that he was building and Joe Walcott not being allowed to box in New York. Let's get into our first piece of evidence. The club that Tom O'Rourke was building, not far from the 20th Century Club. Tom O'Rourke's agents looking for best location for an auditorium. New Haven, Connecticut, August the 13th. Tom O'Rourke, the veteran New York pugilist manager, has a number of agents hustling through Connecticut, looking up the best location for an auditorium which will accommodate 10,000 persons. He will use it to give sparring exhibitions. As soon as the repeal of the Horton Law takes effect in New York on September the 1st. The investigation into the most available Connecticut sites has progressed to such an extent that the indications now are that the Central Clubhouse will be established at either Salvin Rock near the city or Pleasure Beach near Bridgeport. Jack Rose of New York is O'Rourke's agent, who has just been here. At the moment, it seems a bit odd how this club could have anything to do with Tom O'Rourke throwing the Joe Walcott versus Tommy West fight. But I can't explain it without going into the next pieces of evidence. So for that reason, we are going to talk about our second piece of evidence. The feud that Tom O'Rourke stirred up with the 20th Century Athletic Club. This public beef started because Tom O'Rourke had falsely claimed that he had interest or a share in the 20th Century Athletic Club. Now, the rest of the argument between him and Jim Kennedy isn't that relevant. The reason being is because there was not much content in there anyway. It was just Jim Kennedy and Tom O'Rourke going back and forth, accusing each other of all kinds of dirty actions that had nothing to do with this fight. But the main point of interest about this feud is that the 20th Century Athletic Club would be Tom O'Rourke's direct competition if he had decided to build that club in Connecticut that would house 10,000 people. Makes sense for a dirty man like Tom O'Rourke to, start up a feud to just throw a little dirt on the 20th Century Athletic Club, since he's building a club not far from it. But I do have to disagree with guys like Jim Kennedy and Charlie White on that Tom O'Rourke threw the fight just because he wanted to ruin the reputation of the 20th Century Club. No, this was way bigger than that, as you'll see in our third piece of evidence. The letter that Tom O'Rourke sent to his so-called friend in Boston about the club he was building and Joe Walcott not being allowed to box in New York. Now let's read the article again. Tom O'Rourke writes to a friend in Boston that the clubhouse he proposed to build within 40 minutes ride of New York will not be opened until October or November. O'Rourke also states that he will not permit Joe Walcott to box West in New York unless Walcott does business under his management. There's a lot to unpack in this letter, so let's start this club that O'Rourke was building, not far from New York. Hey, didn't we discuss that in the first piece of evidence? The club that Tom O'Rourke is talking about in that letter is probably the exact club that he was trying to build in Connecticut. That would be in direct competition with the 20th Century Athletic Club. Now, who is this friend, right, that Tom O'Rourke is writing to? It seems a bit suspicious that someone writes a letter to a friend, breaking the news that you won't be able to open the club until November or October, and that Joe Walcott must be prevented from fighting Tommy West in New York unless he's under Tom O'Rourke's management again. Well, to me, this looks like he's writing a letter to a business investor, right, that invested or gave Tom O'Rourke money to go and build this club. The problem with this letter is that it's pretty vague. Well, it's not that far-fetched to think that the letter went something like this. Hey, about the club we were building, I'm sorry, but I cannot open it until October or November. And even if I want to open it then, I will need Joe Walcott blacklisted so he can come fight under my management. Well, at first, the problem with what I just said is that why would Tom O'Rourke want Joe Walcott back under his management again? There's no real motive for that. Well, let's first think about how Tom O'Rourke even had the money to build such a club that could house 10,000 people. That's no small club, yeah? For those days at least. I think that Tom O'Rourke was relying on the money that he was supposed to make with the fights that Joe Walcott couldn't fight because he was sick against Below Stiff, Tommy West, and the rematch with Joe Chwoinski. No wonder he was not only so against Joe Walcott not fighting these fights, but said you can also guarantee that if Joe Walcott ever fights again, it will be under his management. He was relying on Joe Walcott to fight those fights so he could make money to pay for the club he was building. So when we string all the pieces of evidence that I presented together, we get that Tom O'Rourke was planning on building a boxing club not far from New York and the 20th Century Athletic Club. The club that Tom O'Rourke was planning on building was going to be in direct competition with the 20th Century Athletic Club since it was so close to it. So he decided to stir up a feud between him and the manager Jim Kennedy of the 20th Century Athletic Club, so he could tarnish their reputation and name and attract more people to his club once it was open. Tom O'Rourke was going to raise the money to build his club through Joe Walcott's fights with Joe Chowinski, Bill O'Stiff and Tommy West. But Joe Walcott got sick with typhoid pneumonia, so those fights fell through. Tom O'Rourke was not happy with this and proceeded to racially insult Joe Walcott in a meeting. Joe Walcott was not happy with this and then rightfully decided to leave Tom O'Rourke's management. Now this was detrimental to Tom O'Rourke's plans, so as a last resort, he wrote a letter to a friend who was probably going to help him build the club in the first place, asking him to blacklist Joe Walcott, so Joe Walcott would be left with no choice but to come back under his management again, so he could raise the money he needed to build this club. Tom O'Rourke needed a lot of money urgently because the fights that Joe Walcott was supposed to have fell through, and he was left with no money to build this boxing club. So Tom O'Rourke forced Joe Walcott to throw his fight against Tommy West on August 27, 1900, so he could bet on it and make the money he needed for his club. People need to stop discrediting and diminishing Joe Walcott's boxing career just off a couple losses. Because once you actually really go look at what really happened on the nights Joe Walcott failed to win, you start to uncover many corrupt, racist, and unfair circumstances similar to the ones we discussed in this documentary.